1895, Greece. 12 cousins drowned with their hands tied to the same rock. The Karystos Confession. The year was 1895. Greece was restless, but Karystos, a small fishing town on the southern edge of Euboea, seemed untouched by the turbulence of the outside world. Its people lived by the tides, their lives measured by the rising and falling of the Aegean Sea. Fishermen returned at dawn with their nets heavy with sardines and mackerel. Women washed clothes along the shore, their voices mingling with the cries of gulls overhead. On the surface, life appeared simple, steady, and safe. But beneath the calm, secrets festered. Families clashed quietly over property, dowries, and inheritance. Old rivalries stretched back generations, whispered about only in kitchens and candlelit rooms. And within the heart of the village, a family of 12 cousins carried a shadow none could yet see, a shadow that would bind them forever to a rock beneath the sea. The cousins were young, full of mischief and promise. Some worked the fields, others fished the coastline, and a few dreamed of escaping Karystos for Athens. Their laughter often carried across the narrow streets. On summer nights, they gathered near the olive groves, telling stories until the lamps in the houses flickered out one by one. To the villagers, they were a symbol of youth, of hope. No one imagined that their bloodline would be tied not to life, but to death. Yet, even in the midst of their innocence, something dark hovered. An argument had erupted months earlier over land that bordered the sea. Their fathers quarreled bitterly, the kind of quarrel that didn't simply fade with time. The cousins, bound by name, but divided by resentment, inherited the bitterness as though it were passed down with their bread and olives. The town itself seemed to carry omens. That spring, storms arrived earlier than usual, tearing apart fishermen's nets and snapping masts like twigs. A goat was found dead near the churchyard, its throat slit, though no one claimed the deed. And in the market square, an old woman muttered a prophecy: "The sea will take the young before the harvest comes." Most dismissed her as mad. But in Karystos, where superstition was woven into daily life, such words clung like smoke in the air. Children whispered of the cursed rock that jutted out from the coastline, jagged and black against the horizon. Fishermen avoided casting their nets near it, claiming the currents pulled strangely there. Some swore they heard voices when the wind struck its sharp edges. To the 12 cousins, the rock was simply part of their landscape, as familiar as the hills behind their homes. They had climbed it, leapt from it, laughed upon it. They could not know it would one day be their anchor in the dark. Life carried on as if nothing stirred. Weddings were planned. Bread was baked in stone ovens. The town priest delivered sermons on forgiveness, though few listened beyond the ringing of the church bell. And still, whispers of envy, betrayal, and old debts grew louder behind closed doors. On warm evenings, the cousins walked together down the shore, their shadows stretching long in the setting sun. Some villagers found it strange that they gathered so often away from others. Some wondered what secrets were shared in the hush of night, when the sea lapped against the sand and the moon carved silver across the waves. But the truth was simple. They were young, they were restless, and they thought they had all the time in the world. None of them could have imagined how quickly life would turn, that the same sea that fed their families for generations would become their tomb, that the same village that celebrated their births would one day whisper their names with dread. And none could foresee the night when 12 cousins would walk to the shore, only to vanish into the dark waters of Karystos. It was a moonless night in late July, the kind of night when even the stars seemed to hide behind veils of cloud. The village slept, doors bolted, shutters drawn against the restless wind. But along the rocky shore, 12 figures moved as one, bare feet pressed into the damp sand, leaving prints that the tide hungrily devoured. These were the cousins, their laughter gone, their steps hushed. Some claimed later that they were lured to the water. Others swore they went willingly, as if under a spell. But the truth was buried beneath the waves, known only to those who walked that final path. What is certain is this: by morning, 12 young bodies would lie at the bottom of the sea, their hands bound to the same jagged rock. The fishermen were the first to see it. At dawn, they pushed their boats into the restless water. One of them, old Giannis, noticed something strange. The waves did not move as they usually did. Instead, the surface churned in circles around a black shape rising just above the tide. As the boat neared, Giannis froze. There, lashed against the rock, was a tangle of bodies. Arms, legs, hair, all entwined. The sea had turned them into a single mass of flesh. The sight was so terrible that Giannis dropped his oar. His companion began to wail, his voice carrying over the morning surf. They rowed back as fast as they could, not daring to look again. By the time the village gathered, the bodies were already bloated, their faces unrecognizable, their hands bound with coarse fishing rope. 12 cousins, 12 young lives extinguished in one night. Mothers collapsed on the shore, tearing at their hair. Fathers stood in silence, their fists clenched, staring at the rock that had claimed their children. The priest crossed himself again and again, whispering prayers into the salted wind. Even the gulls circled silently above, as though they too knew the weight of what had happened. No one could explain it. Why were their hands tied? And a few, lowering their voices, spoke of something even darker, a ritual, a binding sacrifice to the sea itself. The rock became known as the anchor of the dead. Children were forbidden from playing near the shore. Fishermen swore the tides grew wilder around it, dragging nets deep into the abyss. When the wind howled at night, villagers claimed they heard the cousins crying out, their voices rising with the surf. The funeral stretched across 3 days. 12 coffins carried through the narrow streets, lined up side by side. Bells tolled until the villagers could no longer bear the sound. The air smelled of incense, salt, and grief. Women covered their faces with black veils. Men dug graves with shaking hands. And in the silence between prayers, only one question lingered. Who tied them to that rock? No answers came. The priest urged forgiveness, but his words fell flat. A hush settled over Karystos, thick and heavy, as though the entire village was complicit in a crime no one dared confess. And then, weeks later, a story emerged, one that would shake Karystos to its very core. A confession whispered in the dead of night, carrying the weight of betrayal and blood. The confession did not appear in daylight, not toward the olive groves where they usually played, but toward the sea. An old shepherd claimed he heard muffled voices, low and hurried, as though they were arguing. A fisherman swore he saw the flicker of a lantern moving along the shore, weaving between the rocks. Yet none of them stepped closer. Fear kept their feet still. Fear that whatever was happening belonged to something older and darker than mortal quarrels. As weeks passed, the whispers grew sharper. People began naming names. Some swore it was the cousins themselves who tied their hands. A pact of silence, a ritual no one could understand. Others pointed fingers at jealous neighbors, men who had quarreled with the family over land that kissed the sea. And there were those who leaned in close, their voices trembling, to speak of a gathering. They said that, on that black night, the cousins were not alone. A girl, no more than 12, broke the silence first. She told her mother she had seen shadows moving near the cursed rock. Not 12, but more. Figures cloaked and hunched, standing in a circle. Not with ropes, not with knives, but with trust. They followed someone they knew, someone they believed. Why the rock? Why bind their hands together? Why silence? If it was murder, why in such a way, so deliberate, so cruel, so ceremonial? By autumn, the sea had swallowed all evidence. The rope decayed, the rock stood cold and clean, and the cousins' names became hushed prayers instead of laughter. Yet the whispers refused to die. They echoed through the streets at night, through the taverns where men drank too much, through the church where candles trembled in the draughts. Karystos could not bury its secret, for behind the whispers of a midnight gathering, behind the shadowed figures and the flickering lantern, there was still one thing missing. To stand before was to feel a chill crawl across your skin, as though unseen eyes stared from the cracks. The rock jutted out just far enough to be swallowed by the tide each evening. Its edges were jagged, sharp enough to slice skin, and at low tide, seaweed clung to its sides like green, rotting hair. For generations, men had called it unlucky. Nets tangled there, boats drifted into sudden currents, and strange shadows moved beneath the waves. But after the drowning of the 12 cousins, the rock became cursed. No one spoke its name without lowering their voice. When the bodies were pulled ashore, their hands had been tied against that very rock, wrists knotted with a fisherman's rope, as though the sea itself had claimed them. But the rope was not ordinary. Witnesses whispered that it had been doubled, twisted, and tied with deliberate precision. Not the careless tangle of a struggle, but the careful work of someone who knew knots well. A sailor, perhaps. A fisherman. Or someone who had planned every detail. The villagers stood before it for hours that morning, the waves foaming at their feet. Mothers screamed, begging for the rock to release their children. Men threw stones at it, as if punishing it for holding the dead. But the rock remained cold, unyielding, as if it had always been waiting for them. As weeks turned into months, the shoreline changed. The laughter of children no longer echoed there. Couples stopped walking hand in hand along the sand. Even the gulls seemed to circle elsewhere, avoiding the cursed stone. At night, villagers swore they saw a lantern light flickering around it, though no boat could be seen. Some claimed to hear the sound of splashing, as if bodies still struggled beneath the waves. One fisherman, drunk and defiant, rowed close to it one evening, daring the sea to take him too. The next morning, his boat washed ashore splintered, empty. His body was never found. From then on, no one dared to test the rock again. The priest himself avoided looking at it, though he passed it each day. Yet when the confession came to him, whispered, trembling, impossible to silence, he realized the rock was more than a landmark. It was the stage upon which betrayal had been played, the altar where innocence was sacrificed. Every knot in the rope, every bruise on the cousin's arms, spoke of intent. The rock had not chosen them. Someone had, and that someone had bound them not just to the stone, but to silence. Years later, the tides continued to wash against it, wearing it smooth, but the villagers swore the sea never fully cleansed it. On certain nights, when the wind roared through the hills, they claimed they could see pale hands pressed against the stone, clawing for freedom. And when the waves crashed hardest, a sound rose above the surf. Not thunder, not wind, but the faint, terrible sound of 12 voices gasping for air. And though the sea held their final breath, it was the confession that revealed whose hands had tied the rope. The morning after the discovery, Karystos was not the same town it had been the night before. The smell of salt and death clung to the air. Women stood in clusters outside their homes, black shawls pulled tightly around their shoulders, their eyes red from crying. Men walked stiffly through the narrow streets, speaking little, as if words themselves could summon the image of the bodies lashed to the rock. Even the animals seemed unsettled. Dogs howled at shadows, and the goats refused to graze near the shoreline. The 12 coffins, lined side by side, looked unnatural in their symmetry. They were not small boxes carried lightly by weeping families. They were heavy, oppressive, reminders that 12 young hearts had stopped beating at once. No town of Karystos' size had ever seen such a sight. It was not grief for one or two, but grief multiplied 12 times, until it threatened to choke the air from every throat. The priest tried to speak words of comfort at the funeral, but his voice cracked under the weight of it. He spoke of forgiveness, of eternal rest, of the sea's mysterious ways. Yet the people listened with vacant eyes. No prayer could make sense of what they had seen. No scripture could untie the rope that bound their children's hands. As the coffins were lowered, mothers wailed loud enough for the hills to echo. Some fainted, their bodies caught by neighbors. Fathers remained stoic, their grief buried beneath hardened faces, but their silence was more frightening than the cries. The sound of shovels striking earth rang through the cemetery like a hammer in a blacksmith shop. Each thud was final. Each thud drove the horror deeper into the soil of Karystos. After the burials, life did not resume. Shops opened, but few entered. Fishing boats left the harbor, but many returned half empty. At night, windows glowed faintly, but the streets were deserted, as though the town had fallen under curfew. People whispered of curses, of spirits, of divine punishment. But no one spoke openly of murder, not yet. To do so would mean admitting that one of their own hands had pulled the rope tight. Children were forbidden from walking near the water. When the tide rose, waves lapping against the rock, mothers drew their curtains closed, unwilling to see what the sea might carry ashore. The rock loomed larger now, not just a jagged stone, but a reminder that safety was an illusion. And yet, silence did not last. Questions pressed against the walls of every home. Why were the cousins together that night? Who led them to the shore? Why were their hands tied? These questions spread like cracks through stone, small at first, but widening until the whole village felt it splitting apart. The horror was not just in the deaths. It was in the not knowing. The uncertainty bred suspicion. Neighbors eyed one another with distrust. Old quarrels over land and inheritance resurfaced with sharp new edges. Every glance, every whispered word carried accusation. But the worst horror came at night. Families claimed they heard footsteps outside their homes, the crunch of sand beneath unseen feet. Doors rattled though no one stood outside. And from the shore, carried by the wind, came sounds no one dared to investigate. Low, desperate cries that rose with the waves, like the cousins calling out for release. Karystos was no longer a village. It had become a graveyard with a beating heart, every soul trapped in a cycle of grief and suspicion. And just when the silence seemed unbearable, a voice finally broke it, a confession, fragile and trembling, that would change everything. It came quietly, as all terrible truths do. Not in the marketplace, not in the square, but behind the heavy wooden doors of the church. The priest was alone, tending to candles that had burned too low, when footsteps echoed across the stone floor. A man entered, head bowed, shoulders trembling. His voice was almost a whisper, but the words carried the weight of a storm. I was there. The priest froze. He wanted to ask who, wanted to demand more. But the man's voice cracked, spilling the confession like blood from an open wound. He spoke of that night, of the cousins gathered willingly at the shoreline. There had been no screams, no resistance. They trusted the one who led them. They believed it was only a ritual, a test, a secret oath they would carry together. But trust turned to terror when the ropes were pulled tight. The man's words tumbled out in fragments, broken by sobs. He spoke of a plan whispered for weeks among certain villagers, born out of envy, anger, and an old grudge. The cousins had become symbols of inheritance, of land and bloodline. Their fathers had quarreled, but the children bore the punishment. They were bound together, not for sacrifice to the sea, not for God's wrath, but for the vengeance of men. The rock was chosen with care. Its isolation ensured no rescue. Its sharp edges ensured the knots would hold fast. In the blackness of night, one by one, their wrists were tied, until all 12 were lashed in a circle around the stone. The sea rose higher, the tide claiming them slowly. Some cried out, others prayed, but the waves drowned their voices. And the villagers who did this? They stood and watched. The priest's hands shook as he made the sign of the cross. He wanted to silence the man, to deny what he had heard, but the truth was undeniable. This was not an accident. This was not divine punishment. It was murder, planned, deliberate, merciless. Yet when the priest asked who, the man refused to speak. Names would not pass his lips. He had said enough, he claimed. Enough to damn his soul. Enough to burden the priest with knowledge too heavy to bear. And before dawn, the man vanished into the hills, never to be seen again. The priest carried the confession like a hidden wound. He could not tell the families. He could not tell the town. To reveal the truth without names would only deepen the suspicion, setting neighbor against neighbor, perhaps sparking more death. So he locked the words away inside himself, letting the village believe in curses and divine wrath. But secrets have a way of rotting. The silence spread, poisoning the air, Though no one knew the details, everyone felt it, that the truth lay not in the sea, but in their own bloodlines, their own homes. Decades later, the story still lingered. Old women whispered of the Karystos Confession, a secret too dangerous to write, too shameful to tell. Children grew up hearing that the rock held not just the drowned cousins, but the weight of betrayal, the kind that can only come from within a family. And though the priest went to his grave without ever repeating what he heard, the people of Karystos knew enough. They knew that the sea had not taken their children. Their own hands had. The families of Karystos lived in uneasy quiet after the confession. Though the priest never named names, the air itself seemed heavy with suspicion. Every glance at a neighbor carried an unspoken question. Was it you? Every silence in church felt like a shield hiding guilt. The grief that should have united the families instead fractured them further. Cousins no longer visited one another's homes. Meals were eaten behind shuttered windows. Weddings were postponed, and baptisms were hushed affairs. It was as though the village had collectively decided that joy was a betrayal of the dead. But beneath the grief, anger festered. The story of inheritance, whispered for years, grew sharper in people's minds. The cousins' fathers had fought over land, plots of fertile soil, strips of shoreline rich with fish. Some believed the killings were revenge. Others claimed it was a warning, meant to erase one bloodline's future so another could thrive. It was betrayal on the deepest level. Not from strangers, not from passing bandits, but from kin. From those who shared blood, bread, and history. That truth was harder to bear than the drowning itself. As months passed, the silence became unbearable. Men drank heavily in taverns, slamming fists against wooden tables, accusing one another in slurred voices. Fights broke out in the marketplace, old grudges exploding under the weight of fresh grief. Even children, too young to understand, carried the hatred in their games, reenacting the tying of the hands with sticks and rope. The priest watched in horror as the curse of betrayal spread. The real curse was not the rock, nor the sea, but the silence that kept the village rotting from within. Yet he dare not break it. And then came the haunting. Families of the drowned began reporting visions. Mothers swore they saw their children's wet footprints on the stone floors of their homes. Fathers claimed they heard voices at night, calling from the direction of the sea. One widow found her door ajar in the morning, though it had been bolted tight the night before. Whether these were ghosts or the cruel tricks of grief, no one could say. But they deepened the suspicion that the dead were not at peace, that they demanded justice no one dared deliver. The worst wound of all was the silence between those who remained. At feasts, families sat in separate corners, glaring across the room but never speaking. At church, women wept quietly in the pews, their eyes fixed on the altar, but their thoughts fixed on the missing names the priest would never reveal. Blood ties had become chains. Betrayal had hollowed the heart of Karystos, and silence had turned the village into a living tomb. Yet, amid this silence, there was one man who could not carry the weight any longer. A priest whose soul burned with guilt, knowing that secrets left unspoken had the power to poison generations. The priest of Karystos was not an old man in 1895. His hair was still dark, his back still straight. But after that summer, he aged rapidly, as though the sea had taken not only the 12 cousins, but also the strength from his bones. He carried the confession alone, locked inside his chest like a stone that grew heavier with each passing year. Every Sunday, he stood before the congregation, his voice trembling as he read from the scriptures. He spoke of forgiveness, of God's mercy, of the sea that gave and the sea that took. But behind his words lay a torment only he knew. The knowledge that the children were not claimed by God or by curse, but by human hands, hands that likely still clasped rosaries in the same church pews. At night, the priest's sleep was broken by dreams. He saw the cousins bound against the rock, their eyes wide with terror as the tide climbed higher. He woke drenched in sweat, clutching his cross, whispering prayers into the dark. Yet the prayers gave no relief. Instead, he felt the voices of the drowned pressing against him, demanding release, demanding that their story be told. But how could he speak? To name the guilty without proof would tear the village apart. To speak the truth without names would only deepen suspicion. Silence seemed his only choice. And so he bore it, year after year, watching as Karystos withered under the weight of unspoken guilt. Those who visited him in the rectory noticed his eyes, once calm, now haunted. He grew thin, his hands shaking when he raised the chalice. Children feared his hollow gaze, whispering that he had seen the ghosts of the drowned. Some even believed he had bargained with the sea himself, trading his silence for his own survival. The truth was simpler, but heavier. He had become a prisoner of confession. On stormy nights, villagers swore they saw the priest walking along the shore, barefoot, his robes dragging in the sand. He would stand facing the cursed rock for hours, unmoving, as though speaking to the 12 cousins whose voices only he could hear. When questioned, he claimed he was praying for their souls. But some whispered he was speaking with them, answering their cries with words the living could not understand. Over time, he withdrew from the village. He ate little, spoke less, and carried himself like a man already half buried. When he finally died decades later, his body was found clutching a scrap of paper. No words were written on it, only a smear of ink where the pen had begun and then faltered. The people of Karystos buried him near the cousins, believing perhaps his soul would join theirs. Yet even in death, his silence remained. He had carried the secret to the grave, leaving behind only rumors, fragments, and the terrible knowledge that betrayal had come from within their own blood. And still, the sea did not rest. For if the priest carried the secret in life, it was the generations after him who carried the curse. Time moved forward, but Karystos never truly healed. The village children grew into adults, married, and had children of their own. Yet the shadow of 1895 lingered like a wound that refused to close. Every generation inherited the silence, and with it, the suspicion. Grandmothers whispered the tale to wide-eyed children, warning them never to wander near the cursed rock. Fathers taught their sons how to fish, but always pointed to the waters around it as forbidden. Even the bravest sailors skirted wide around its black edges, as though the sea itself marked it sacred. The story was not told as history. It was told as a warning. As the years turned to decades, strange happenings continued. Nets cast too close to the rock often came up shredded, as if slashed by unseen hands. Fishermen swore they heard voices calling across the waves on misty mornings. Some claimed to see shapes in the water, pale faces staring up before vanishing into the depths. Children born into the families of the drowned carried the weight most heavily. They grew up with the story, spoken in half-whispers at their bedsides, with the stares of neighbors who wondered if their bloodline carried a curse. Some fled Karystos, moving inland to escape the suffocating shadow of the sea. Others stayed, trapped by duty or fear, their lives entwined with the very waters that had claimed their kin. What haunted the village most was not just the tragedy itself, but the unanswered questions. Who tied the rope? Who stood on the shore and watched 12 young lives slip beneath the tide? No one dared speak openly, but everyone carried suspicions. Entire families stopped speaking to one another, their silence becoming as much a part of daily life as bread or prayer. At weddings, whispers filled the air. Were the bride's ancestors guilty? Was the groom's grandfather among them? At funerals, mourners stood apart, separated not by grief, but by blame. The dead cousins were never allowed to rest, because the living never forgave. By the early 20th century, when Greece itself was torn by wars and occupations, Karystos remained trapped in its own private battlefield. Outsiders who visited spoke of the village's strange quiet, the way laughter seemed forced, the way shadows felt heavier near the sea. They heard the story, dismissed it as folklore, but still felt the unease that clung to every stone, every wave. And though the names of the guilty had long since been buried with the priest's silence, The curse of Karystos remained alive in the minds of its people. The drowned cousins had become more than victims. They had become guardians of a truth too dark to be spoken and too powerful to be forgotten. Even now, generations later, the sea of Karystos carries their weight. Fishermen still cross themselves when passing the rock. Locals still tell travelers to stay away from its waters. And children still fall asleep to the tale of 12 cousins who trusted the wrong hands and were bound forever to the tide. The living may have carried on, but the drowned never released their grip. More than a century has passed since that night in 1895, yet the Sea of Karystos remains restless. To outsiders, it looks no different from any other stretch of the Aegean, blue waves glittering under the sun. But to those who belong to the village, the water is never just water. It is memory. It is accusation. It is grief that refuses to fade. The rock still juts from the tide, black and jagged, its surface worn smooth by waves, but never erased. Locals avoid it, even now. Tourists who wander too close are quickly pulled back with firm hands and stern warnings. Not there, the villagers say, their eyes dark with something unspoken. Never there. Every storm brings reminders. The sea rises, the waves crash, and the wind carries voices that no one dares to follow. Some claim the cries of the cousins echo in the spray, their last breaths caught in an endless cycle of drowning. Others tell of lanterns seen bobbing across the waves, though no boats sail at night. A few whisper of pale figures climbing the rock, only to vanish when lightning splits the sky. For Karystos, these are not just ghost stories. But the villagers know better. They know the names of the 12. They know where their bones rest. And they know that somewhere in their lineage, the guilty blood still flows. Children born in Karystos grow up with the story stitched into their lives like a scar. They are told to respect the sea, to never tempt it, to never forget. Every generation adds a new layer of fear, of ritual, of remembrance. And still, each tragedy feels like an echo of 1895, a reminder that the water has never forgiven. At dusk, when the horizon turns red and the sea glows with dying light, some villagers still kneel in the sand. They whisper prayers not to God, but to the cousins themselves, asking them to rest, to forgive, to finally let Karystos breathe free. But the waves roll back with the same endless rhythm, indifferent, eternal. The truth remains trapped in that water, tied as tightly as the cousins were to the rock. The guilty are gone. The priest is gone, but the sea remembers what men tried to bury in silence. And in Karystos, memory is a tide that never retreats. For most of the world, the story of the 12 cousins is just a dark footnote in history, a half-forgotten tale of grief by the sea. But for Karystos is the beating heart of their tragedy, a wound that never closes. The village has learned to live with it, but never to escape it. And so, even now, more than 100 years later, the question still hangs in the salt air, heavy and unanswered. Who tied the rope? The Sea of Karystos does not speak, but it refuses to forget. But the villagers know better. They know the names of the 12. They know where their bones rest. And they know that somewhere in their lineage, the guilty blood still flows. Children born in Karystos grow up with the story stitched into their lives like a scar. They are told to respect the sea, to never tempt it, to never forget. Every generation adds a new layer of fear, of ritual, of remembrance. And still, the sea takes its due. Boats lost, men drowned, nets torn apart in sudden storms. Each tragedy feels like an echo of 1895, a reminder that the water has never forgiven. At dusk, when the horizon turns red and the sea glows with dying light, some villagers still kneel in the sand. They whisper prayers not to God, but to the cousins themselves, asking them to rest, to forgive, to finally let Karystos breathe free. But the waves roll back with the same endless rhythm, indifferent, eternal. The truth remains trapped in that water, tied as tightly as the cousins were to the rock. The guilty are gone. The priest is gone. But the sea remembers what men tried to bury in silence. And in Karystos, memory is a tide that never retreats. For most of the world, the story of the 12 cousins is just a dark footnote in history, a half-forgotten tale of grief by the sea. But for Karystos, it is the beating heart of their tragedy, a wound that never closes. The village has learned to live with it, but never to escape it. And so, even now, more than 100 years later, the question still hangs in the salt air, heavy and unanswered. Who tied the rope? The Sea of Karystos does not speak, but it refuses to forget.